Thanks again. I'd like to say I welcome everyone to the webinar. I want to thank you for spending the next hour or so with me, and as we share on the topic of Agile projects beginning with the end in mind. And what I mean by that is sort of a lot of Agile projects really dive in. They suffer from the habit of diving in. It's sort of part of the methodology where you start sprinting or you start iterating very, very quickly. And in some contexts, that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's the healthier way to go, is to dive in and start iterating. But there's a whole genre or family of contexts where I think that's probably not the right thing to start with, to immediately start. You know, you read a book on Scrum or on XP, and then you dive in the very next day with not a lot of thought, and you start iterating and you start producing software. And in those contexts, for example, medical systems or health critical systems is a good example. You want to put some thought, and that's thought into it, and you want to prepare some artifacts, and you want to get your feet underneath you as a project team before you start diving in and iterating. And that's the focus of this workshop or this seminar, is to look at some of the practices that I've gotten great traction out of as far as setting a baseline understanding for a project before you begin. So getting the beginning under your belt, or getting a good start to an Agile project. From that outline perspective, we're going to talk about chartering, good old-fashioned chartering. From a traditional project perspective, we might have some Agile twist to it. We're going to talk about chartering practices. They're not chartering direct, but they're practices that lead towards sort of that advanced end-to-end planning. We'll talk about Agile project management, a technique called blitz planning, sprint or iteration zero, how to define a sprint, or how to define an iteration that's actually focused towards beginning rather than just executing work. And then we'll close with goal setting, which are some of these, I think, real critical focus points for getting a project off the ground successfully. So I wanted to skip. I want to talk about diving in context. There's a whole genre of context where it really makes sense to dive in and just start iterating, and they're really not. This webinar really doesn't focus on them so much. They're relative to Agile, and they're healthy. So, for example, a low culture. If you have a project in a domain that has a low culture of project management discipline, that may be a good case for just diving in. If you have small projects with very little investment, another good case for just diving in. Short cycle time, very low cost projects. You have no regulatory concerns. You're in a startup, an entrepreneurial company where competition, just creating a product to compete is the first, and to generate some revenue is the first, the prime directive, rather than process, or rather than, upfront baking the project. That could be very well, a right approach. Where you have well-formed teams, they're comfortable, they're highly skilled. Maybe they've done Agile before, they're very Agile aware, and they're well skilled in the Agile methods and in software development in a specific domain. There's a lot of these contexts where just diving in and starting to sprint immediately, perfectly healthy, perfectly fine. I'm not really talking about those, but there are some contexts where it's not so. That's probably not the right approach. I talked before about healthcare or regulated environments, defense contracts, where you have third-party interfaces, maybe to waterfall contractors, a case where you have requirement sign-off, you're interfacing to a project management office is another case, just listing a few of these, where you have very large-scale projects, where you have a team and this is your first Agile project and you've not formed that team before. The team isn't well-behaved or well-formed from an Agile point of view. They've never worked together. You have a brand-new domain. You have a list of traditional requirements, but you don't have a backlog. You don't have simple user stories or a simple backlog, or a notion of requirements from an Agile point of view. They're not prioritized very well. They're not clarified very well. The list goes on here of context, of scale, distributed teams, where these are contexts where pausing for just a second or two, or for a day or two, or for a sprint or two can make a heck of a lot of sense in order to get your feet underneath you to make forward progress. So that's the direction here, is projects in those contexts. First thing I want to talk about is chartering. From my point of view, a definition, this is a lightweight definition. I'm really trying to get you to think about it. For anyone listening in, if you've done a project charter before, I want you to leverage that vehicle. I want you to leverage the intent of that, which is a startup artifact to sort of describe the beginning of a project, to establish a baseline for budgeting, to establish a baseline for team understanding. That's exactly what I'm talking about here. It's sort of artifact independent. It's a process and its artifacts. They establish a vision. They define key goals. Project participants can be defined. Limits and constraints are clearly outlined. You might have a sense of a WBS or a schedule with high-level milestones. Ultimately, success criteria could clearly be identified in the charter. And then the notion of negotiation or trade-offs, identify trade-offs. Risk can typically be put in a charter. But what I'm talking about is that traditional vehicle that we use for projects can be morphed in an Agile context and can be incredibly healthy and helpful in getting the beginning, getting the why. Why are we doing this project? Getting that established, getting that buy-in. So I don't want you to throw that out. I actually want you to leverage that chartering experience that you have. From my point of view, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but I wanted to go over what I think are some key or critical components of a charter. If you have these in yours, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine as well. I think the key attribute is that you charter, not what the dynamics of the charter are. It's that you establish a beginning, that you talk about mission and vision, that you talk about the critical aspects of the project in advance to establish that baseline to move forward. So a couple of things here are purpose, goals, scope, organization, resources are typical components of a charter, at least in my experience. Other components are approaches and priorities and assumptions and constraints and risks and sign-off, that notion of sign-off. So there's 10 areas that I focus on to really get you thinking about, well, what is chartering and what is that process? From my point of view, it's beyond the document, beyond the titles and the headings. Charters has these steps of it establishes a mission and a vision and a purpose. It gets the team. It talks about the team responsibilities, the roles and responsibilities, the skill set that you need. It talks about high-level planning, and it talks about gaining that stakeholder support and management understanding and buy-in, which all of these things I think are crucial from an Agile point of view. For example, stakeholder support, one of the critical attributes of agility is engaging your stakeholders continuously in the project, not just in the beginning, not just at the end, but during the life cycle of a project. And there's no better, there's other ways, but there's no better way to really highlight how important that is than in the charter at the beginning of the project to establish those needs of the stakeholders, those engagement, those decision-making processes that sort of demand that in order for us to undertake this project. These are critical stakeholder engagement points that we need, and you need to buy into them as a stakeholder, and you need to support the project team. And that's the sort of nature here that the charter connects the organization to the team and the team to the organization. This is just a graphical view of what I'm talking about. You have this view of early requirements, and then they flow down through those 4 areas to high-level plans and strategies. It's an iterative process. You have inputs, and then you're forming these as a team. You're working as a team. And I think the most important block or bubble is at the bottom right, and you're gaining that team commitment on the part of the team. And you need that in Agile as well, that team understanding, that team empowerment, that self-directed team who understands what's expected of them. So the chartering process is driving that within the team. You want to think of this as iterative. So one of the changes you want to make in traditional chartering processes can be relatively heavyweight. They can be relatively rigorous. They can have phases and gates and approval cycles. And you want to sort of keep some of